Welcome back to Grumpy Vet Garage. Today we're going to get back to work on my 2021 Toyota Supra, trying to solve the problem of excessive brake dust. My Supra is a street car. It's seeing spirited driving. It's not seeing autocross racing or road racing or track days, at least not yet. But I still want to maintain the same performance that I have currently with the OE pad, with something that creates less dust. The generation of brake dust that you're seeing is typically that from the actual braking compound in the pad. It also can be from rotor material, but when you start getting a more aggressive pad, something with a higher friction coefficient, often what comes with that is an increased amount of dust. If you see Formula One, IndyCar, NASCAR, IMSA road racing, you'll see that the dust generation by a vehicle like that greatly increases from the end of their run to the beginning of the run when they put on fresh tires. So while I'm not trying to do any racing per se with my car just yet, I am wanting to reduce the amount of dust generation, and I'm hoping to achieve that with the use of Hawk's performance ceramic pads. Okay, so here's a look at one of the front PC performance pads. They're ceramic material. It's a really nice, nice pad, as you would expect with any of, not just Hawk, but really any higher end manufacturer. It's actually got a shim to kind of reduce some of the noise and vibration or harshness. But yeah, it's a good looking pad. So Hawk Performance actually makes 4 different compounds for the A90 Supra. Those 4 compounds rated from the least aggressive to most aggressive start with their performance ceramic, the ones that I'm going to place on my car. And then the next step up is their HPS 5.0 pad. And then the step above that is their HP Plus. And then finally, their highest or the most aggressive pad would be their DTC 60 pad. So the HPS 5.0 pad, it has a operating temperature window of 100 degrees to 750 degrees with an optimal window of 100 degrees to 550 degrees. They say these pads are recommended for street use and then light track. So it's not a pad that you would be afraid to try to do some light track activity, but not a dedicated track pad. The next pad would be their HP Plus pad. That one has an operating temperature of 100 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit with an optimal range of 300 to 600 degrees. So you can see there with the 300 to 600 that it's losing some of that cold temp performance, but once these pads come up to temperature, you should be good. They recommend these for street use, but also for autocross and track days. And then the DTC 60 compound pads, they have an operating window of 400 degrees Fahrenheit to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit with an optimal window of 600 degrees to 1200 degrees. So as you can see, these pads are not your daily stoplight to stoplight, stop sign pads. These need to be warmed up to actually get them to work optimally. And Hawk reflects that. They say these are track use pads and they do not recommend them for any use on the street. Now, the PC pad that I'm putting on my Supra, it has an operating temperature of 100 degrees to 650 degrees with an optimal window of 100 to 450. Not a huge window compared to the other ones, but that's the general area where a street pad is going to operate. And that's where Hawk places these pads. They don't recommend them for really any kind of competition use, autocross or track days. But it is a pad designed for the street. So a little bit about what they say about this performance ceramic pad is Hawk says they understand the needs of today's ceramic brake pad users and have specifically formulated our composite material to meet and beat the stringent low noise, ultra low dust performance standards that have been set. They engineered to reduce NVH or noise, vibration, and harshness. Performance ceramic is a premium disc brake pad that delivers excellent performance mile after mile, providing a linear friction profile that allows our vehicle's ABS system to effectively operate. Our unique compound has the advantage of never sacrificing power to achieve traditional ceramic pad attributes. With Hawk's PC, you can expect reduced brake pad wear, longer rotor life, and our quietest ride ever. They make some claims in there that I think are kind of interesting, and we'll kind of go over those. The number one thing they were talking about, point they made, was extremely quiet. That's good. It's not really the reason I'm getting them. If you have a Supra, you know when you pull out of your driveway or pull out of your garage, those first few slow braking moments are a little noisy, a little bit squeaky. Again, kind of what's expected. I mean, I think the pads are decent for a street car and work effectively, but with that, usually comes some noise from vibration. So these are supposed to be more quiet than the OE pad, so I'm hoping so. But again, not the big deal. Ultra low dust. That's really why I'm going this direction. Something interesting to find out about ceramic pads and the low dust. It's not so much that they don't make dust as much as the dust that they make is lighter in color and does not want to adhere to your rim compared to the brake compounds you see in a more competition-based pad. Those compounds, again, make a lot of dust, but that dust also will stick to a hot car rim. So ultra low dust is what we're wanting. Improved stopping power. In comparison to what, I'm not exactly sure. I'm hoping that the ceramic just operates similarly, maybe a little bit better than the OE pad, but that's really why I went with Hawk ceramic rather than an off-the-shelf ceramic that you might be able to get at your auto parts store. And then it says gentle on rotors for extended pad life. I've seen some conflicting tests about ceramic pads and how gentle they are on rotors. But that's not really a big deal to me, or I would think to a lot of Supra enthusiasts. If we need to change pads or we need to change rotors, I think kind of so be it. But if it does have an improved rotor life and improved pad life, great. That sounds good. And then, of course, stable friction output. They have a lot of testing on the Hawk website about different temperatures and the friction coefficients associated. And their PC ceramic, granted, is their internal testing. It's not independent testing. Shows that in the operating window that the pads have a very stable friction coefficient, as in it works well at low temps and then stays relatively stable across the temperature range. Granted, a smaller temperature range, but it's a very stable pad. So I liked all that about the PC, the performance ceramic from Hawk, and that's why I'm going to put it on my Supra. So let's go ahead and put it on the car. Before getting to that, if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to Grumpy Vet Garage, liking this video, sharing it with friends. Additionally, we have a Grumpy Vet Garage merch store. This is a Grumpy Vet Garage shirt. We have Supra specific shirts in the store. We also have hoodies, pull over, and zip up. It really helps out the store, really helps out the channel, I should say, if you decide to purchase something from the store. So by all means, check it out and get something for yourself. But let's go ahead and move forward to get this car off the ground, take the tires, rims and tires off, and put on these brake pads. So the car is jacked up and placed on jack stands. All four wheels and tires are removed. Now we need to come over to the brake reservoir and remove the cap. When we're changing the pads, we're going to press the pistons back into the caliper. And by relieving that pressure on the caliper, it's going to push fluid back into the reservoir. So we have to remove the cap in case it was to overflow. It shouldn't overflow, but we need to remove the cap to do this process. Okay, so we unlock this locking tab, and then we can lift away this panel. And then underneath the panel on the driver's side is the brake reservoir. We just need to loosen this cap to allow air to escape as we press the pistons back into the calipers. Moving down to the front, I went ahead and turned the steering wheel to bring the caliper out towards us. For one thing, to make it easier to see, but also, for whatever reason, and I think I know the reason, the factory has glued the pads to the pistons in the caliper. The reason being, I think they had it to try to keep noise down. Granted, the pads are somewhat noisy from the factory, not too bad. But because of that, rather than trying to slide them out, which they normally would, I'm going to go ahead and remove the caliper to be able to pry them off of the piston. But the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and drive out the 2 pins that are holding the pads into the caliper. The punch I'm using is a 5/32 punch, and I'm using just a small, almost like a jeweler's style hammer, brass on one side, non-marring on the other, because you want to be careful with this finish. Just be careful as you're driving out the pins, but it is going to require a hammer and a punch. Now that you've driven them out most of the way, a little bit of tension on this retaining plate right here, this retaining plate, if you put a little bit of tension down, it can make it easier to wiggle the pins out the rest of the way. And there's the top one. And then the same thing on the bottom. And there goes the bottom one. Now with that removed, this retaining pin plate should come free, but because of the weights that are on the factory pads, it may not. So I'm going to try to wiggle and see if I can get it to come free. So there wasn't really enough clearance to get this to come past the weights. So I'm going to use a spreading tool. This spreading tool is made by, I pronounce it Lyle's. I've had it for a long time. You don't necessarily need to use this type of spreading tool. You probably could just pry back either with your hands or with a pry bar, but a spreading tool like this or the ratcheting style spreading tools would work. But I'm just going to try to pry these apart just a little bit to get this retaining plate out. Okay, as we can see, that really helped. So now I was able to rotate and pull this plate out, and you can kind of see the orientation with the way the spring is placed in there. But we need to go ahead and set this aside. Now, normally, if these pads weren't glued to the pistons, you would just need to come in with a spreading tool, spread them apart, and then the pads would slip out the top. So they call these like a quick change caliper setup, but because of the adhesive that's used, it's not going to come out the top. So for first time, we're going to have to actually unbolt the caliper from the knuckle, and then be able to get it free of the rotor, and then we can pull them off the individual pistons. The 2 bolts that hold on the caliper are an E16, and there's one here up top, and then one further down. They're torqued on pretty good. So I'm going to try to see if I can get in there with just a ratchet. I may need to get a breaker bar in there. Okay, the top one's loose. Moving on to the bottom. Okay, so I got the bottom one free. So in the actual factory manual, it lists these 2 bolts that hold this caliper on as one-time use. The reason I believe they're listed as one-time use is because they come pre-installed with Loctite. I'm not going to replace them, and you can let me know in the comments if you think that's a terrible idea. But I'm going to reinstall them with Loctite and reuse the bolts. So that's the bottom bolt removed. So with that bolt in, I was able to rotate this up. I really don't like the idea of too much prying, but they just were not coming off. But you could probably hear a little bit of that adhesive coming loose, but you're just trying to pull this free. I know some people are cringing about me prying against that, and I'm doing a little bit of that myself. Just trying to, you'll hear it when it starts coming loose. It's okay. And then trying to get this to come free. That, you may have heard that. That was pretty good. It sounded like it came unadhered. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this back up and pull this bolt back out. Again, this is not what you would have to do on every other change after this because they're not going to be glued in. but you'll lift this up, and hopefully these will come free. Just like that. Come free just like that. And then the other one, hopefully it'll come free as well. Oh, hear it? It's coming free. Okay. Hopefully, yeah, that's kind of what I was afraid was going to happen. So I had this happen on the other one. Let me secure this caliper real quick, and then I'll show you. Okay, so here is the inside pad. And as you can see right here, this is actually the dust boot off one of the pistons on the caliper. If this happens, don't freak out. It does come, it's just a seal, but you can see how it's glued to the actual brake pad. We got to peel this off, but we can put this back in. This isn't that big a deal. It's not good, but it's not that big a deal. I stated earlier that I haven't really done anything more than spirited driving with the car, and that's true. But for you guys that are doing like autocross and track days, these boots see a lot of heat. And with that heat, they'll crack. So if you guys are changing pads over and over and over again and burning through them, which is great because you're enjoying your car and you're doing it competitively, you also need to make sure that you're not getting cracks in these boots. The job that these boots are doing is preventing brake dust and trash from getting back in between the cylinder of the caliper and the piston and then damaging the seal. So this is actually an item that can be changed on the car, and I'll show you. Really, all you have to do is place it really back in. There's a small groove right here that actually attaches to the piston, and then this presses into the body of the caliper. That's really it. What you don't want to do if this pulls out is put anything that lubricates into the caliper before you're able to get this in. Any kind of lubricant getting on the outside of this can very well make it pop back out easily next time. You want it to be dry going in. But let me go ahead and clean up some of this real quick, not with any lubricants, but let me clean this up really quick, and then I'll show you what you got to do to put this back in. So coming in with something like this is just a trim tool that you would use to pull off like trim panel plastics. Coming in there, you can actually grab the edge of this piston. You want to be very careful. You're not trying to pull it out really far or pull it to where you can potentially get it to come out crooked. So just a little bit of tension and you'll see it start coming out. You don't have to go real far. In fact, that's actually pretty good right where it's at. So you see this exposed rim here? That's where on this dust boot, this little rim is going to pop into that. So just try to walk it around, which is not too awful difficult. But, and again, you don't want to put any lubricants or anything on these because it's going to prevent the other side of the boot from sticking into the housing. So now I have the boot on the piston. Now you just need to, you can push the piston back in a little bit. Sometimes that'll pull pistons out in other areas. But with that back, you then can seat the rim of the seal into the housing. And again, you road racing guys, this is something that you could do periodically when you're checking your calipers and checking your brakes in between track days, just checking to make sure those boots aren't cracked. And they're not that difficult to change because I just did one right there. So that's back in. Now we just need to verify that the pistons are back, and then we'll be able to start working towards mounting the caliper back up to the knuckle, and then putting in our pads. One thing I didn't think about when I was doing the other side is there is a small sensor that goes in the front, and you'll see the one on the back because I did the driver's side rear. When we get to the rears, you'll see that sensor. But what it does is it fits into this little groove on the pad. It just pops down. You want to make sure it's fully seated. Its role was really to be a sacrificial sensor. Once your pad wears down to that sensor, it will expose the sensor. and it'll set off a light on your dash if you do it. But of course, with us changing it before the pads were worn out, it never got close to the sensor on that side or on the back, so it didn't go off. But yeah, the sensor, it's pretty self-explanatory. When we get to the back, I'll show you it. Okay, now we can go ahead and mount the caliper back on. You have the option to use either red Loctite or blue Loctite. I've decided to go ahead and use blue Loctite. Granted, red Loctite, with the amount of heat that goes through brakes, it probably wouldn't be that big a deal to get it loose. But we're just needing to retain the bolts. The torque's going to do most of the work, so I'm going to use some blue Loctite. Doesn't have to be too much, and I really like this gel kind rather than the kind that kind of runs everywhere. I know Loctite brand, I know this is Permatex, but I know Loctite brand also makes a gel type, so the kinds that run everywhere, you don't have to use those. So I'll go ahead and run these in, and then we'll come back to torque them. So with Loctite on both mount bolts, we need to come in with our torque wrench and torque the mount bolts to 59 foot-pounds. That was the bottom one. Okay, so we got it all torqued. So in the future, without glued in pads, this is where you would start to do the install. Like you would pull the pins, you'd pull the clip, and then you'd pull the pads, new pads in, clip in, pins in, and that's how you would change brake pads. So moving on from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this disc really good with brake clean, just because we've done a few things, cleaning things up, and I just want to make sure that our disc is clean so that we don't have any problems with the bedding process of the pads. Okay, now before dropping in the pads, we actually need to lubricate where the pads are going to operate. The manual from Toyota or BMW says to lubricate these ledges right here because the pads move in and out. You got to be careful being too aggressive, putting lubrication here and getting some on the rotor or getting too much on the pad. This is what I like to use to lubricate any kind of brakes. It's just a silicone paste. I mean, it says right on it for brake calipers. They make ceramic ones for this. I don't know how much better those are. But because it's not a grease in many cases, it doesn't break down rubber seals. So it's just less aggressive, but still does a good job of lubricating the area. I think it's shining too much. But yeah, let me go ahead and show you how I put this on the pads. So here's our new Hawk pad. And then where it's going to ride, you'll see on the edge of the shim, there is this area here. This is what slides back and forth in the caliper. So this is where lubrication needs to be placed on the brake pad. So what I do is I use the brush from the silicone paste and then get it on here and make sure not to get it onto the friction surface. So just a little bit. It doesn't really got to be crazy. But the key thing you want to do, again, is make sure that you're not placing the silicone paste on the friction surface. So there's that. Now, once it's lubricated, all you got to do is then turn around and slide it in. Like, and a little tight in there, but there we go. We're in. And then, okay, I got both pads loaded in. Again, this is an easy load caliper. With them both loaded in, we now need to take our clip, which rides right here. Oh, I forgot to mention. As you can see, these pads, they don't come with the factory weights. Not all of them are going to come from with the factory weights. If you have some that have some, that's great. I am not worried that this is going to be a problem. Hawk doesn't require them. I know there's probably a way that I could press them on. But you'll see with many of your road racing pads, granted this isn't a road racing pad, but made by a company that makes road racing pads, It's not needed. It's not required. It's there to dampen vibration. And again, like I said earlier, the noise wasn't really the thing that was bothering me about the brakes on the car. It was the dust. So I want to make sure to highlight that before I move on too far. But again, the clip goes right here, and then we need to lubricate up, again, silicone paste, lubricate up these, and you run the pins back through, and they secure this clip down. So let me go ahead and lubricate up the pins. Okay, so you want to get the pads positioned so that the rods can actually come through, or the pins, I should say. So using my non-marring side of my hammer, again, it doesn't take too much force, but we need to get this pin to come all the way through and then into the caliper. A little downwards tension on the plate also helps. But what you're trying to do is make sure that this indentation and this one is well within the middle of this clip so that this clip can retain the pin. We come in with a couple hits with the punch just to make sure it's fully seated, and we're good. So now you can come back and kind of wipe down your caliper, make it nice and pretty, and then you can rotate the tires back straight so that you can put your wheel back on. So moving to the back, this brake setup is more similar to a conventional car brake, except for the fact that there is an integrated emergency brake that's in here. So to change these pads, we're going to have to actually remove the caliper from the actual bracket. The fasteners on the back, there's hex bolts back here, are 14 millimeter. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those. Yeah, they're not too awful tight. Again, these bolts here are listed as one-time use as well. Same thing. I'm going to put Loctite on them and put them back on. Well, not Loctite, but thread locker. And this one will have the brake sensor on it. And the brake sensor style on the back is the same as what is on the front. So this brake sensor is on the passenger rear, and then the driver's front for the front. I also got my hook available in case I need it. I didn't end up using it on the front, but you still want to keep stuff like that around because you don't want to damage your brake hose. So with the two bolts removed, you need to reach behind the bracket and find where the sensor wire goes and disconnect it to give you some room. It's really hard to show you, but after you get that, you're able to pull the caliper back, but the wire for the actual pad is still sitting there. So you can pull the pad out like so, like push it out, and then it's got a little bit more slack, but we have to disconnect the sensor from this pad. So I repositioned the camera. I'm going to try to do this work from behind the camera, but it may be difficult. So this pad, which is hanging here, it gets popped out, but you can see the sensor right there is still attached to the pad. So we need to pull that sensor out of the pad, which is, you don't want to damage the sensor, because if you do, then you got to go get a new one. So there you go. It's disconnected. That sensor has to feed through the inside of the caliper. What I noticed on the front one, you'll see this metal clip here that goes around the sensor. It came out. So make sure you still have the metal tab in the sensor so that it can retain it into the pad. So let's set that aside. We can pull the outer pad away, and now we're ready to put our new ones in. Now what's interesting is on the pads, let me see if I can get in the shot, you can see the inner pad, the location of the rivets are wide, and then the outer pad, the location of the rivets are inside. You'll notice on the new Hawk pads that the rivets are in the same place. So there is an inner and an outer pad. So now to put in the new pads, we have to push back this piston. This piston is also designed to be rotated back. So I have this tool right here, that will push and twist the piston back in. Some people say you can do it really easily with needle nose pliers, and that very well may be true, but I'm going to try to use this tool. Basically, it fits in like this, and then you just need to crank in while turning the piston. I'm not going to be able to do this on camera. I'm going to have to do it off camera, but you engage the teeth into the piston, and then you start pressing and turning it back in. As you can see now, the piston's been pushed back. The tool actually really did help. It's just very difficult with the camera here to be able to actually film me screwing it in. But basically, you're going to maintain tension while screwing and rotating the pad back into the caliper, or the piston. So now we need to move on to prepping the new pads to go into the bracket, and then we'll put the caliper on. So now with the pads, I already put the back one in, but the front one is going to be, or the outside one is going to be the same way. It has the ears. Let me show it to you. The ears on the pad, they need to be lubricated with that same silicone paste to allow them to slide in these grooves right here. So we're really just lubricating the ears. You're not trying to get it anywhere on the friction surface. So now with the pad lubricated, we can then come in, drop it into the tab, drop it into the second tab, and now we can make sure both pads are seated down against the rotor. We can then come back with the caliper, take it off of the hanger, making sure that the wire is still pulled out around the caliper. Go ahead and bring the caliper in. Okay, now we can come back with the sensor here, and you see this little nub section right there? That's the side that needs to go towards the rotor, and then you will plug it into the pad. Okay, now with the caliper back in place, of course, and the sensors plugged in here, the two bolts get Loctite and then get torqued down to 26 foot-pounds. I really wanted to be able to show you more with the camera right in there for you to see how all this was going together. But unfortunately, it wasn't like the front where it was easy to see. It's a little more difficult. If you have any questions about anything, including step-by-step on what I'm doing here on the rear or on the front, by all means, leave a comment. I'll more than happy to walk you through it or answer any questions you may have. Okay, so now that we're done with the install on the brakes, we need to go ahead and get the car back on the ground. Of course, properly torque on your lug studs. Make sure the cap to the brake reservoir is back on, but we need to bed the brakes. This process is listed on the Hawk's website, but also on the bottom of the boxes that they sell. So their Hawk brake pads, when you look at the bottom of the box, it'll give you what the actual procedure is. Right now, I'm kind of going to a spot where I can actually do the procedure. My neighborhood, the speed limit's actually not high enough to do the procedure, but I'm coming over to a road where I feel like I should be able to do it. So the procedure is you're going to do 6 to 10 moderate stops from 30 to 35 miles an hour. You're never going to want to actually come to a complete stop with these stops. You want to keep the car actually moving. And then right after doing the 6 to 10, you're going to want to do 2 to 3 hard stops from 40 to 45 miles an hour. Not so hard that you engage the ABS, but still hard that you actually heat up those brakes. So I'm going to try to wait to get myself a little bit of room here so I can do this. But you actually may smell the pads a little bit too, which is fine. And before I forget, after you're done doing that process, you're then going to drive the car normally for like 15 minutes just to let the system cool down. But let's go ahead and get into the process. So I'm coming up to about, see here, 35 miles an hour. And then I'm going to come to a stop, let it roll, come back to 30 to 35 and do it again. You're going to do this 6 to 10 times. that's 2. That was 10. Now we need to go ahead and go to 40 to 45 miles an hour. And then this time we're actually going to try to hit it pretty hard. Try to get her in a straight line, not that it really should matter. And here we go. Again, don't let it stop completely. That was a pretty good bite, so granted she's not fully bedded yet. Let's see what it does on the next one. It's pretty good. I'm going to do one more really hard one. Really trying to burnish the pads real good. And there we go. So that's a process of just kind of working the pads. Granted, I have the window up because I'm trying not to get the wind noise, but you should be able to possibly smell the pads at this point. But now what you're wanting to do is just normal driving for 15 minutes just to let the system cool down. Don't be too abusive on the braking system at this point. Again, you're just trying to cool it down, let all those resins settle, and then from there on, you're good. So my plan is to drive the vehicle around for probably a week to maybe even a month, just kind of see if the low dust claim made by Hawk Performance is correct. I don't have any reason to believe that they're not telling the truth, but I want to make sure that before I tell you, hey, you should get these pads because they're low dust. Are they really low dust? And then additionally, performance on the street, how they feel. Granted, that was just a break-in process, but I didn't feel like I had any less braking performance than I did with the factory pad. But again, before I turn around and say whether or not I recommend these pads or I think that they're working the way that Hawk says they are, I want to give it some time. So be looking for that follow-up video on these pads. But if you have any questions about anything in this video, selection of pads, how I installed it, please let me know in the comments. Again, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with your friends. But until next time, thanks for coming and seeing me in my garage, and have a good one.